Our next speaker has saved lives in the operating room. Now he's fighting to save Alberta. Dr. Dennis Modry is a renowned heart and lung surgeon. He's the former CEO of the Alberta Prosperity Project, but he has been a fearless advocate for Alberta autonomy before it was cool. For over 2 decades, he's been writing policy, building movements, and challenging Ottawa's grip on the West. He's turned principle into action and frustration into a very real plan. So please welcome a man with the heart of a surgeon and the spine of a statesman, Dr. Dennis Modry.
All right. Thank you very much, Sheila, Rebel News, and everybody who is here today. It's a tremendous opportunity for myself as the co-founder and chair of the Alberta Prosperity Society. And by the way, I'm the one that convinced Mitch to take on that role as the CEO of the project. You know, it's interesting, Sheila touched on my cardiac surgical career, and my wife reminded me I should say this, and so I'm going to. You know, during my career, I could help one person at a time. But as a result of what we're doing with respect to the Alberta Prosperity Project, which primarily the purpose is to educate the public on the rationale and merits of Alberta sovereignty and how to get there, that I could help millions of people. And so this is a tremendous motivator for me to spend virtually my entire day and evening doing this sort of work. So it's a real privilege for me today to be able to share some information with you. Now, starting off, I suspect that everybody here is on the independence train, but I may be wrong. Are there any people here that would rather Alberta remain in Canada under the current terms and cost of membership? No, okay, well that makes it easier. So some of the things that I'm going to share with you today, you will be able to use when you're talking to other individuals. And of course, there's a wealth of information on the website. But I found it interesting with respect to Corey's comments and David's comments, just the issue of the political elite class, and it sort of reminds me of the cute story about the very distraught woman who's sitting at the confessional, and she says to the priest, "Father, please forgive me, I have sinned horribly." And the priest says to her, "Well, my dear, what is it that you did?" And she says, "Well, last night I killed a politician." And the priest responds and says, "Oh, my dear, I'm here to listen to your sins, not your community service." All right, so let's get into the issue of Alberta sovereignty. And I just want to highlight a couple of things that I think are relevant. When you look at the result of the recent election, what do you see? You see Saskatchewan, Alberta, Central BC, and Northern BC. They did not vote the way the rest of Canada voted. And this has been a perpetual outcome over many, many decades now. And why is that? Well, it's very simple. It's because there's a difference in the culture and the values between those who live in the prairies, in the West in general, and the rest of the country. And this is why we're facing the kind of problems that we are facing right now. But just to highlight something for you, does anybody here think things are going to get better with the new Prime Minister? It's very unlikely, right? Very unlikely. In fact, they're cousins. I don't know if you knew that. But having said that, has anybody looked at Mr. Carney's book entitled Values? Some of you may have, but let me just cite a couple of things for you which I think are quite relevant. He claims that Western civilization is morally rotten, corrupted by capitalism, which has led to, you guessed it, a climate emergency. And to deal with this, he says that what is going to be required is the rigid controls on your individual freedoms, on business. Now, when he refers to business, he's referring to any business aligned with the development and transport of our natural resources, and rigid controls on banks and financial institutions that might be involved with the financing of those businesses. And he admits that assets will be stranded, that you won't be able to resell your internal combustion engine. And he also points out that for ordinary people, life is going to get much worse. You won't be able to travel. You will be restricted in how much meat you can eat, whether you can fly or not. Everything will become more difficult for you, and that people will experience far more poverty. That is what he says. And how is he going to achieve these objectives? Well, he very clearly points out that the mechanism is censorship, controlling the access to your accounts, a digital ID, and if he gets his way, and he's been promoting it, a central bank digital currency. And if all that happens, folks, we're done. All right? So we have this opportunity right now to do something different. But I want to touch on for a second, how did we get into this mess? And then highlight some points that you can use when you're talking to others. So everybody knows that Canada, or rather Alberta and Saskatchewan, were incorporated into Canada September 1, 1905 by Sir Clifford Sifton. He was the Minister of the Interior in the Liberal government of Sir Wilfrid Laurier. And some of you have heard this, but it's important and it bears repeating, because it helps explain why we are in the situation that we are now. So what he said to an audience in Winnipeg in 1904, before Alberta and Saskatchewan joined Canada, he said these words: "We desire, and all Canadian patriots desire," so Canadian patriots in 2004 were only the people living in the East, so "we desire, and all Canadian patriots desire, that the great trade of the prairies," that's Alberta and Saskatchewan's wealth, "shall go to enrich our people in the East, to build up our factories and our places of work, and in every legitimate way contribute to its prosperity." In that statement, did you hear anything about the benefit to the West? Not at all, right? So we started as a colony, and we continue to be a colony, to be pillaged and plundered for our wealth, and to have their values rammed down our throat against what we believe is correct. Now, how has this been manifest economically? Well, if we consider equalization, the national energy policy, other confiscatory tax policy, and the cost of federal regulations, we've given to Ottawa over $800 billion, for which we've not received a cent in return. And with respect to the national energy policy, which devastated Alberta for the next 12 to 15 years, why was that even implemented? Well, according to Mark Lalonde, the brainchild behind the national energy policy, at that time, he said, in justification for the national energy policy, he said, well, we could not let Alberta become the center of economic power in Canada. All right? And nothing is changing. Everything that's happening right now is to subjugate the West and to control us and to pillage our wealth. Now, let's look at what's happened in more recent times. If we look at the last several years, as the Premier has pointed out, $500 billion, $500 billion of planned investment into Alberta did not occur. Did not occur. Why? Federal regulation and taxation. There wasn't a business case. It wasn't that $500 billion wasn't invested, it just wasn't invested in Canada. And added to that, from the Frontier Center for Public Policy a few weeks ago, released a research report that points out that because we cannot get our oil and gas to international markets, we lose $26.5 billion every year. $26.5 billion every year. And so how have these policies, these anti-energy, anti-agriculture, and anti-resource development policies impacted Alberta with respect to economic growth? Well, we know that as well, because there's been an economic analysis of economic growth in all industrialized countries in the world. Economic growth in Canada, compared to all other industrialized countries, we are dead last. Why is that? Obviously, it's because of federal regulation and taxation. So a sovereign Alberta, ladies and gentlemen, can bring about far less regulation, far less taxation, and far less governance. And that's one of the things that we are aiming for, obviously, for Alberta. Now, David touched on the issue of the Premier as well. Oh, I should digress and say one other thing. The former Trudeau government, which is pretty much the same, except for the change in the leader, also wants to lower the voting age to age 16. Why do they want to do that? Well, they want to ensure that a Liberal government is perpetually in power. And what else do they want to do? How about giving every 17-year-old $2,000 a month as a basic income? What's that going to do in terms of creating a culture of dependence? It's going to make those people perpetually dependent on the federal government. That's the whole idea of it, right? So let's look at what our Premier has done now. And I want to put this in context in terms of sovereignty, okay? Sovereignty in its simplest terminology is not a left or a right issue. Politically, it is not left, it is not right. Sovereignty is something that benefits everybody. And by the way, sovereignty means nothing is above you. For example, nothing is above God, God is sovereign, correct? So when we look at the term sovereignty, in its simplest form, it's self-governance, freedom from external interference. But pragmatically, sovereignty is freedom from persecution. And you're going to really understand this. Freedom from persecution. What kind of persecution? Political persecution, economic persecution, cultural persecution, and religious persecution. Have we faced all of those things from this federal government? You're darn right we have. All right, so the UCP government, Premier Smith. I have a lot of respect for Premier Smith. She's a tremendous communicator, she's bright, but she's rhetorically standing up for Alberta. But is she really? Is she really? Do her actions follow her rhetoric? And I'm going to tell you, I don't think so. But to their credit, they did introduce Bill 1, the very first bill when the UCP government was elected, the Alberta Sovereignty Within the United Canada Act. Why do that? Ostensibly, it's because they want more sovereignty. They want to get out from under federal overreach of provincial constitutional authority, which has been occurring for decades. Is it possible? Because some of those things that we want to change require changing legislation. And some of those things require opening and changing the Constitution. So let's look at what's happening. How is she responding? Well, she's responding with strong rhetoric, but there's also been some 18 lawsuits launched by the provincial government against the federal government on a number of areas in relation to the development and transport of natural resources, censorship, property rights, for example. I mean, and I can digress for a second, property rights. This is an important one. David Lametti, the former Minister of Justice, said Canadians don't have the right to own property, and he's right, constitutionally, that's correct. We don't. And this starts off with gun rights. But on your own land, if you don't pay your taxes and you don't have a mortgage on your house, if you don't pay your taxes, you'll find out who owns your property. So we don't really have property rights. In a sovereign Alberta, we would. So that's an important point. So let's get back to Danielle Smith for a second here now and rhetoric. So we understand that Bill 1 was designed to protect Alberta's interests against federal overreach, but it isn't really working very well. Those lawsuits, by the way, particularly if there's constitutional issues, they're all going to be decided by the Supreme Court, and those cases can take years or decades to resolve. Do we have time? No, we don't. We don't have time to deal with this kind of nonsense. We need a leader who is actually going to lead and make things happen. But the leaders really of the Alberta Prosperity Project, this grassroots populist movement, is not people like myself or Mitch or anybody else. It's you folks. You folks are the ones that are leading this. All we are doing is providing you educational material that you can use. So let's look at the issue again about rhetoric not being followed by action. She could have unilaterally taken control of 5 things: policing, provincial policing, pensions, immigration, employment insurance, provincial tax collection. She hasn't done it. I have no idea why she hasn't done it. At one point, she said an Alberta pension plan, for example, is a no-brainer. When Mitch Sylvester went out and did those 87 town halls speaking about the pension plan, he's the one, that effort moved the needle to the point where 55% in the latest poll on taking control of the pension plan, 55% of Albertans are now in favor of an Alberta pension plan thanks to Mitch. So you give him a hand. Now, Quebec has control of provincial policing, just like Ontario, but it also has control of immigration. It also has control of tax collection. So there's no reason why the Premier should not, or there's no reason why she should not have taken control of those 5 things. But let's look very specifically now at the difficulty that we find ourselves in terms of making change. It's one thing, I'm at 15 minutes and 44 seconds. Am I okay still? I got 5 more minutes?
Okay.
You said I had 20 minutes. Do I have 20 minutes?
You do have 20 minutes. I just
Okay.
want to give everybody an opportunity to ask questions for today.
Right. So here's the point, is if you want to open and change the Constitution, and this is why it's so difficult to do, here are the 4 hurdles and plus 1, very simply. First, you got 7 of 10 provincial legislatures representing 50% of the population have to agree. That has to be ratified by the House of Commons, and we don't have representation by population. Has to be ratified by the Senate, there we don't have representation by population. And Quebec has a de facto veto, right? So let's say miraculously we were able to get over all of these hurdles. Then if there's any battle after that, then it's going to be the Supreme Court that decides. And as David Parker pointed out, the Prime Minister office appoints all of the Supreme Court justices, and there are 3 from Quebec, 3 from Ontario, 1 from the Maritimes, 2 from all of Western Canada. How do you think those decisions are going to be decided? In favor of Alberta? No. They'll be decided in favor of the East because that's always the way it happens. We cannot get out from under this corruption unless we do something different. Now, you know, David has touched on this, but it bears repeating a couple of points. That petition that requires 177,000 signatures, many of you know that we already have the contact information of over 250,000 people. So the challenge, thank you. And we have 18,000 volunteers. So we will be able to, organizing with people like David, who has tremendous organizational skills, we will be able to get those 177,000 signatures very soon. Now, in that referendum, ladies and gentlemen, there's going to be roughly 2.9 million people in 2026 eligible to vote. We need at least 1.6 and preferably 1.7 million people voting in favor of Alberta sovereignty. So this is going to be the challenge, and it's going to be all hands on deck. The petition, somewhat difficult, but you know what? That is doable. We're already there in terms of the numbers, as I said. So everything that we're doing follows the Clarity Act, right? This is the legal pathway for a province to leave Canada and become a sovereign nation. But I want to make one point very clear with respect to the Clarity Act. There's a section in the preamble that says that a successful referendum obligates the federal government and the other provinces to negotiate in good faith, but negotiations might lead to secession. Well, what does that mean? That also means that it might not lead to secession. Well, what does that mean? If it doesn't lead to secession, only two outcomes. Number one, Alberta gets everything that it wants in the negotiations. However, Section 4A of the Clarity Act says you can't have a referendum if the purpose, 4A and B, if the purpose is to negotiate a better deal, right? So it can only mean then when it says negotiations might lead to secession and the corollary is might not lead to secession, means one thing, and that is negotiations have failed and the federal government and the other provinces are not willing to open the Constitution and change it to remove Alberta from the Constitution. There's another solution to that. And when you look at the way the Supreme Court analyzed the whole issue of a unilateral declaration of independence, there's section 154 and 155 in that analysis. This is really important to understand, is that if a region is subjugated, dominated, exploited, and their aspirations of self-determination are not met, that region has the right to have a referendum on sovereignty, and it is political legitimacy and it becomes legal legitimacy when other nations acknowledge that Alberta has had a successful referendum, and if the Premier has the guts to do it, the day after that successful referendum, she will declare Alberta as a sovereign nation. And the US, we know this firsthand because we were there talking with them on April the 22nd, will acknowledge Alberta as a sovereign nation, and we've done it. Thank you. There you go. Questions?
Questions for Dr. Modry? I'll come over. Actually, I've been to your table. I'm going to come over here. Question, not a statement. Perfect.
Okay, so my question is, if Canada technically isn't sovereign itself, how does Canada grant Alberta to be a sovereign nation through this process? Because Canada doesn't actually have land, it cannot be sovereign, right? As Charles has stated, unceded land. So how can, let's say, Corporation Canada determine that Alberta has the authority to be a sovereign state? They don't have that authority to give that, am I correct?
Well, my understanding, and this is going to be a good one for Keith Wilson, who's a constitutional lawyer, but the reality is, and you get back to the whole discussion of the Westminster system and how Alberta or Canada, became Canada, and you go back to the BNA Act and you add all of these things up. Yeah, and this is the issue. So for those people who are advocates of the Westminster statute that we're already sovereign, for example, the problem with that is, and I don't know how many of you have seen that video by Doug Force. It's fantastic. It's about the myth of Canada or the illusion of Canada, and it's very, very well done. And there's nothing wrong with that. Everything is accurate in that video, except that there's no judiciary in Canada that will acknowledge and accept it. So the reality is that our only pathway out of this mess, that I understand from talking to constitutional lawyers, is that is the pathway that we've discussed. There's a legal pathway, and it's an international legal pathway as well.
Okay. What I'd like to know is which Albertans are going to be allowed to vote in this referendum. Will there be a rule about having lived so many years in Alberta, this sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it sort of emanates from the 1995 Quebec secession referendum, when we understand, I haven't seen the documentation of this, but I had understood that, and I've been trying to find it, that if you hadn't lived in Quebec for at least 5 years, you were ineligible to vote in that referendum. Now, the issue of immigration is a relevant one, and I know a lot of people will think that and believe, and much of this is true, is that if you're led in through the Liberal government policy, you're going to be beholden to the Liberal government, and you're going to vote in favor of Alberta staying subjugated to the federal government. But there are many people that have moved here from other countries, and they're finding that things aren't the way they expected. That's one thing. And then there are many other people that have moved here because Alberta is, relative to the rest of the country, much freer with a lower tax base. And so this will be up to the provincial government to make that decision, who is eligible to vote. But we expect that there will be about 2.9 million eligible voters, and I don't think there are going to be any constraints on people who are relatively new immigrants. But you know the way we overcome this, if there is a concern in that way, is instead of having 1.6 million voters vote, we have 1.9 million voters vote. In other words, just about everybody votes. And if you really believe that your life will be a lot better in a sovereign Alberta, as I do, and pretty much everybody else in this room, then you need to get everybody that are your friends, families, colleagues, and strangers out to support the successful referendum, or the referendum when it is called in 2026.
Why is Canada so negative with Alberta leaving?
Why is Alberta so negative about Alberta leaving? That's a great question.
Why is Canada so negative
Oh, why
about
is
Alberta
Canada?
leaving?
Sorry, why
Yes.
is Canada so negative about Alberta leaving?
I don't think we're negative about it.
Well, I'm really glad that you asked that question, because just because of time, I didn't make mention of this. Well, we're the cash cow for Alberta. For Canada. We give every year about 60 to 65 billion dollars to the federal government, and we get back 12.5 to 14 in major federal transfers. So they keep 40 to 50 billion dollars to use as they want. It doesn't come back to Alberta. They don't want to lose that money. You know, it reminds me of a cute story in terms of money. And I just have to tell you, this comes from Arnie Schwarzenegger. Arnie Schwarzenegger once said, you know, more money doesn't make you happier. He said, I have $120 million, and I'm no happier now than when I had $100 million. I can tell you the rest of Canada will not be happy when Alberta leaves. And David Parker is right. They will do everything to undermine all of us and undermine this whole movement. And it will be a fear campaign like you've never seen before. But I can tell you what, for every question, every fear-mongering question, we have answered those questions to dispel the fear. And there are over 70 or 80 answers on our website right now to all sorts of questions.
Thank you for being here today, Dr. Modry. My question, who's going to decide the wording on the referendum when it happens?
Who's going to which? Sorry?
Who's going to put forward the wording on the vote of the referendum? Who's deciding the words that they're going to use?
Right, that's a very good question as well. So there's two parts to this. There's the wording on the petition to force the referendum, and we've already, Keith Wilson and Jeff Rath have already defined, they're two constitutional lawyers, they've already defined that question. And just for everybody's edification, the question that is going to be posed for the petition is, do you agree that the province of Alberta shall become a sovereign country and cease to be a province of Canada? That is the question for the petition. When it comes to the referendum, we've been advised that the provincial government will determine the verbiage of the question, they will determine the question and the timing of the referendum. We're not really particularly happy about that, but the provincial government is the provincial government, and they will control the referendum.
Okay, last question over here.
So in regards to the vote, we need 51%. Is that 51% of voters or 51% of Alberta?
51% of eligible voters.
Okay, that was a quick and easy answer. Everybody, let's thank Dr. Modry for his speech and for taking our questions.
Thank you so much.